So welcome to the 2023 Bentley Lecture in Sustainable Agriculture, and especially warm welcome back after 2 years of doing this by Zoom. We're really happy to see everyone here, and mostly without masks, so that's great. It's really a wonderful opportunity to reconnect with people. My name is Brent Swallow, and I'm a professor in resource economics and environmental sociology here in the Faculty of Agricultural Life and Environmental Sciences at the University of Alberta. And with my colleague Guillermo, who's right over here, Guillermo Hernandez Ramirez, I'll be one of the co-hosts for this event. And I'm going to let Guillermo introduce himself in a few minutes. First of all, we'll do a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the University of Alberta is located on Treaty 6 territory and respect the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. So we're here in person in the 2023 Bentley Lecture on Sustainable Agriculture, presented this year by David Lobb, professor at the University of Manitoba. And in a minute, I'll hand over to Guillermo to introduce Professor Lobb. First, I'd like us to acknowledge the sponsors of this year's event. Their support this year is especially welcome with the resumption of the live version of the event. And I'm going to ask that the representatives of the organizations that I'm going to list please raise their hand as I call them. Let's not clap for them one by one. Let's wait until I introduce all of them, and then we can clap for them, for all of them. So in no particular order, Alberta canola growers, got a hand, or maybe perhaps not here. Corterva Agriscience, Inotech Alberta, these are great sponsors. Alberta Barley and Wheat Growers, thank you. The Alberta Institute of Agrologists, where's Dave? There he is. Alberta Pulse Growers. Okay, so please join me in thanking these sponsors. We see this event as an important opportunity to honor Fred Bentley's legacy, and Guillermo is going to mention a bit more about that in a minute. We're thus very delighted to extend a special welcome to Fred's daughter, Anne, who I think is here. Welcome, Anne. Fred's granddaughter, Sheen, is here. Fred's great-grandson, Jacob, is here. And Jacob, you're the last in the line, so you have a lot of tradition you have to follow up on. So it's wonderful to have you here. One of my jobs is to help with the transition from the poster session to David's lecture. For that, I'd like us all to thank the students for being here, for introducing their work to us, and for showcasing their technical and communication skills. Please join me in a round of applause for the students. We've had a panel of judges, esteemed judges, working and have prepared the nominees, the winners of the top 3 posters, and I'm going to announce that at the end of the lecture. We had 10 interesting posters presented to us, so the judge's job was difficult. The posters involve students, undergraduate, master's, and PhD students from a variety of programs in renewable resources and agriculture, food, and nutrition sciences. So in terms of timing of the event today, I'll pass in a minute to Guillermo to introduce himself, provide a bit of background on the Bentley Lecture, and introduce our keynote speaker for the day. We expect Professor Lobb to speak for about 40 minutes. I hope that's not a surprise, followed by a Q&A session that Guillermo will moderate for 15 to 20 minutes. Guillermo will then pass back to me, and I'll announce the winners of the poster session. Thereafter, you're free to stay on for looking at the posters again, for chats, up till something like 6 o'clock. And with that, I'll pass to Guillermo, so welcome.
Thank you, Brent. I'm associate professor at the Faculty of Agricultural Life and Environmental Sciences, and I'm soil scientist as well. We welcome all of you today, and grateful that you are able to join us. I would like to talk a bit more about the Bentley Lecture. Professor Fred Bentley academic career was mostly here at the University of Alberta and spanned over about 36 years. And that included that Fred Bentley was a dean of our faculty from 1958 to 1968. Dr. Bentley's career included contributions in soil science to the development of sustainable management practices, and not only for improving Alberta's agriculture, but also abroad. Dr. Bentley received the Distinguished Alumni Award, which is the highest honor that the university can bestow onto an alumnus. This lecture, the Bentley Lecture in Sustainable Agriculture, is funded by an endowment that was created so that we can have this special event every year and be able to exchange research and updates in areas related to soil science, agricultural systems, and sustainable agriculture. Our presenter today, David, also contributes to these goals of exchange of ideas and advancing science. And we are very pleased to have all of you in here. And not only because of the Bentley Lecture, but also because today is February 15th, is Canada's Agriculture Day. And we also would like to highlight this aspect and celebrate agriculture in Canada. Joining us today, we also have a couple of my colleagues from the faculty. We have Nadir Irving, chair of the Department of Renewable Resources, and also John Parkins, chair of the Department of Resources, Economic and Environmental Sociology. And they are also joining the crowd today as well. Our presenter today, David Lobb, is a professor in landscape ecology in the Department of Soil Science in the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg. And David actually grew up in a farm, and I share that background with David as well. He grew up in a farm in southern Ontario, and he earned his Bachelor of Science from the University of Toronto, as well as his Master and PhD from the University of Guelph. He actually is internationally recognized. He has a high international profile, and as he had been able to contribute with research in tillage translocation and tillage erosion, not only in advancements and findings, but also developing new methods and also modeling in terms of methodology. His expertise in soil erosion will become evident through his presentation, but also he had been thought after by, in terms of his expertise, by the United Nations in different departments, including the International Atomic Agency, as well as the Food and Agricultural Organization, the FAO. Not only that, but he had been involved in efforts to generate indicators of environmental monitoring with the Organization of Economical Cooperation and Development. So that international involvement not only highlights the contribution of Canadian scientists, but also it brings new insights into the work that we do here in Canada. David currently co-chairs the FAO Intergovernmental Technical Panel in Soils, and David is actually a fellow of the Canadian Society of Soil Science, the Soil and Water Conservation Society, the Soil Science Society of America, and he actually was also inducted into the Canadian Conservation Hall of Fame. So he's a very well-recognized and established scientist here in Canada and internationally, and we are grateful to have his presence and his expertise that he's sharing with us today. With that, I would like to turn things over into David, and we welcome our Bentley speaker with an applause.
Thank you very much, Guillermo and Brendan. And I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to give this presentation today, and certainly for hosting me. They've been fantastic hosts for the day so far, and it will extend into the evening, I'm sure. And I'd like to thank all of you for attending. This is, as was said, one of the first events many of us have been able to participate in person, so it's great to see this many people out. As noted in the presentation summary, soil health has rapidly become the focus of soil science and soil management in Canada and around the world. It's quite a topical thing. In my presentation, I will be addressing what I see as interesting and important issues on that topic. I won't cover all aspects of it, but I've picked out a few that I want to provoke you with today. It's intended to be informative to a lay audience and thought-provoking for those invested in soil health, which many of you are. Let me begin by saying I'm very honored to give this prestigious lecture. The event is part of an enduring legacy of Dr. Fred Bentley in Canadian soil science. It's extremely significant for me. I would like to take the opportunity to acknowledge one of Dr. Bentley's many achievements. I'm not sure why that's funny.
I recognize it from very long ago.
Well, you'll be happy.
Part of the archives in the Bentley house.
Okay, well, I've got something for you or I was thinking your granddaughter, which will, or niece, oh, okay, or your daughter, or niece. I've got something from one of those books that I found in my office that I have to give to you today. So, that's an appreciated interruption. The achievement is hosting the 11th Congress of the International Soil Science Society in Canada, in Edmonton, back in 1978. He literally brought the world to Canadian soils. We've always talked about this in the Soil Science Society meetings, how critical this was in establishing the Canadian Soil Science Society and making it a mature, well-recognized entity worldwide. And I'm pleased to tell you that the Canadian Soil Science Society will once again host the World Congress of Soil Science, which it's now called, in 2030. So I'm hoping that I'm able to attend, but it's a few years away. But part of the reason why we're able to do this is because of Dr. Fred Bentley's efforts back in the 70s. I've organized my presentation into 5 parts. I'm going to start with a bit of background, a bit more than what Guillermo provided, and working towards a view for the future. Some of what I'll be presenting challenges the conventional thinking on soil health, so it's probably a good idea to give you a little bit more information about where I'm coming from, both academically, intellectually, but also physically as well. So this is showing Southern Ontario. I just got to make sure this works. This is showing Southern Ontario, and that's where the farm is located, just near Clinton, Ontario. And as Guillermo said, I grew up on this cash crop farm, and I studied earth and environmental sciences at the University of Toronto for my bachelor's, and then did a degree in soil science at University of Guelph for both my master's and my doctorate degrees. Now, while carrying out these studies, I worked across central and eastern Canada before moving to Winnipeg in 1999. So I've been in the prairies for 23 years plus now. Over my career, I've carried out research and extension across Canada and into the United States and other parts of the world. And this is just illustrating some of the areas where I've done work on soil erosion sedimentation. My research spans soil and water management and conservation, but my focus has always been on soil erosion and its impacts at a landscape scale, which I'll try and impress upon you today, and at a watershed scale. Now, the goal of my research program is the development of sustainable soil management systems, hopefully improving this type of situation. This photo says a lot about where I come from, this picture of the family farm. This is back from 1978, and this image, although a little worn, there's a few specks on it, clearly demonstrates the impact of unsustainable soil management practices. And my dad would acknowledge that as well. And you can see the extent and severity of soil degradation caused by intensive cropping and tillage. All of that land there is exposed subsoil, all those white areas. So that's pretty typical of land in southern Ontario that's been intensively cropped and tilled. This picture was taken right before my father converted the farm to no-till, and when he established the first landscape-scale strip trials in Canada comparing conventional tillage and what was then called no-till. And there was 2 of those strip trials set up on that farm back in about 1980. Now, although somewhat academic, I find it interesting to consider the origin and meaning of the term soil health. So I'm going to give you a bit of that information. The first time I became aware of the term was when Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada published the report, The Health of Our Soils, back in 1996. And in that, soil health was defined as the soil's capacity or fitness to support crop growth without resulting in soil degradation or otherwise harming the environment. Now, thinking about the title of the report, And considering the amount of debate about the use of this term at the time, because it was not without quite a bit of debate, I decided to spend a few hours sleuthing the web to figure out when the term first was used and how it was defined. Wasn't necessarily a great use of my time because I didn't find much. The earliest reference to soil health I found was in organic farming literature back in the 1980s, and there was no definition. So it's been around for a while. But I attribute Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada for really thinking this out and coming up with a definition back at that time. Since then, particularly over the last 10 years, the term has gained widespread popularity because I suspect every single one of you has heard this before you read the title of my presentation. It has been embraced by the public, government, and non-government agencies, universities, the agricultural industry, and farmers. Soil health is now viewed more strongly from an ecologic perspective. So it has evolved since Ag Canada first defined it, as illustrated by this USDA definition. Soil health is the continued capacity of the soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. A little more broad than the Ag Canada definition. And we seem to see this term everywhere these days. Just in my work alone, I'm just going to give you a listing of things where I have to live with the term soil health. It's a subject taught in my degree and diploma courses on soil and water conservation management. Every course, every year, we have a very animated discussion about what soil health is and what it isn't. And in my work with the Red River Basin Commission, where I co-chaired the Soil Health Committee, we had lots of discussions about soil health. When we formed it, we had to figure out what it was we were supposed to be doing because no one really knew what soil health was. And in my work with Soil Conservation Council of Canada, where I serve on the board and have presented on the status of soil health in Canada at their soil health summits, and I helped develop the soil health report card for Soil Conservation Council of Canada. In the Senate of Canada's ongoing hearings, which you may have heard about, on the status of soil health in Canada, where I've given testimony, and in what consumes much of my time these days, the Intergovernmental Technical Panel on Soils under the United Nations Global Soil Partnership Program. And this is just showing two of the products. And let me tell you, there are many documents and publications and activities that they've been working on over the last few years targeted at soil health. It's something that everyone around the world can relate to. As well, in several of my presentations and publications, such as this one, A Few Twists and Turns in the Road to Soil Health, where I explore some of the issues around it, which was published in the American Society of Agronomy's Crop and Soils magazine. So, you would hope that I know exactly what soil health is, but to be honest, I'm not so sure I do. And I'm going to raise a number of questions which I don't necessarily think I have answers for. Part of the reason why this is such a popular term is that the term health is so relatable to people. Health is a concept we use to characterize a personal state of being so we can relate to it. But we should remember that we can feel healthy and look healthy, but it does not necessarily mean that we are healthy. Nor does it mean that we are free from health risks. So all those things also apply to soil health. So it's a very precarious situation to be in a healthy soil. But is the term health meaningful in the use in the context of soils? So here's a few questions. Healthy to what end? For what purpose? For producing crops and producing crops profitably? If so, then it's simply another term for soil productivity. If it's producing crops profitably without adversely impacting the environment, if so, then it's simply another term for soil quality. And I'm going to expand on some of these definitions because I think it's important to note these are all images associated with those terms as you find them on the web. And clearly, the term soil health applies as an extension of the concept of soil quality, which is an extension of the concept of soil productivity, which is an extension of the term or concept of soil tilth. You can look at these, they all look very similar in the photos. That's because they all have a similar underlying concept behind them. So, just expand on that a little bit. Soil quality is the nature of the soil as a resource for use in balance with the air, water, and resources, very much an environmental perspective. Soil productivity is the ability of a soil to produce high-yielding crops. And soil tilth, which is the oldest of the terms, which you can find in the literature back hundreds of years, is the soil physical condition as a seed bed and a root zone. Now, all of that being said, people like the term soil health, so it's going to be here for a while. We're not going to be reverting back to some of these other terms. Soil health is what we've got, and it will be here, I suspect, for quite a long time. Now, if the term is going to be with us for a while, then it's important that we get a better handle on what it is and its limitations in its use and application in agriculture. So, question, what is a healthy soil? What does it look like? So, I'm going to ask you to do a little visualization experiment here. I'm going to ask you to all close your eyes. Now, you may not want to do that, but if you don't, please play along. So please close your eyes and visualize what you think of as a healthy soil. I'll give you a few seconds just to ponder all the little things you see in that healthy soil. So you're probably visualizing a thick, black topsoil, more specifically organic, rich, well-structured, loamy texture with a deep solomon containing lots of soil critters. And that's what I'm trying to show here. And that's what most people think of. You have a really good idea of what a healthy soil is. Now, the next part of this, a couple of other questions. What do you think an unhealthy soil is, and what does it look like? So I'm going to ask you to do the same thing again. Close your eyes and visualize what you think of as an unhealthy soil. Now, you're probably visualizing an exposed subsoil, which you typically see on eroded hilltops. That's the example I use in a lot of my pictures. Topsoil with little organic matter, lots of carbonates, little or no aggregation or aggregate stability, often stony, and containing very few critters. There's a big contrast between what is healthy and unhealthy. So we all get that concept pretty well. Now, there's no doubt that soil health is a valuable concept to guide scientists, educators, government agencies, non-government agencies, industry agencies, and ultimately land managers, because all of them can do the same thing you just did. They can understand, conceptualize what a healthy soil is and what an unhealthy soil is, very generally. And it's important to inform the public and consumers of products derived from the soil, whether that's food or fiber from the agriculture or from forestry. And this is the most important part of why we have readily adopted the term soil health. The public gets it. They can do that same thing. They have an idea of what a good soil or healthy soil looks like and what a bad one looks like. Now, although there's clearly value in the concept of soil health, there are some issues in its application. And I think it's important to explore these, and so I'm going to do that. If I can move it forward. So, in reality, there isn't one archetypal healthy soil, nor is there one archetypical or archetypal unhealthy soil. You have many soils. In Canada, we have many soils. These soils vary in their properties, reflecting their unique environments. We have 10 soil orders with strange names such as luvisols and chernozems, which probably everyone knows what they are. Most of us know what they are. And when we get down to the individual soil series level, we have hundreds of soils across the country, like at our home family farm. We have the Huron clay loam and a few other soils there, but the Huron clay loam is the big one we have. But if you get down to that level, I think there's actually thousands of these soils across the country. Now, I see Jerry nodding his head. Yeah, I looked to see if I could find the number, and I thought someone told me it was over 2,000 in the National Soils Database. Now, each one of these soils has a unique healthy state. And remember, the development of each soil progresses towards a balance with its natural conditions, its local hydrology, and its regional climate. This equilibrium with nature is what defines a soil's health. Consequently, the optimum health of one soil can look very different than the optimum health of another soil. And this means that there literally are hundreds, if not thousands, of different healthy soils in our country. There's no one standard healthy soil. This complicates the whole concept of soil health quite a bit. Now, in addition to the spatial heterogeneity, there is also temporal changes to consider. For some soils, their so-called healthy state changes over time. In some cases, over decades and certainly over centuries. And in Canada, we have relatively young soils that are actually under a fairly rapid state of development, moving towards something that may be an oxisol in thousands of years. But there are changes that have occurred in the short period of tens to hundreds of years, depending on which soil you were talking about. Now, Another thing that I'd noted, which I think is important to note for all of us, it certainly is when I talk to farmers, I believe the assessment of soil health is too complicated and too expensive. So although there are potentially thousands of them and you can all describe them differently, when we talk about soil health, it's often perceived as just way too complicated, and because of all of the different, as I'll show you, all the different things you can measure, potentially way too expensive. So I'm going to ask another question. What does a healthy soil look like? We've already gone through that. Well, in terms of how it's assessed, I'm going to show you a bit of information from the Cornell framework for soil health. It's a popular approach, and I'm just going to use that as an example. This is showing a table from the Cornell soil health assessment. And it's widely used across North America, as I said. Now this table lists the potential indicators of soil health. So I present this to students saying, these are all the things you could measure if you wanted to assess the soil's health. And most people look at that and they just are shocked because they say, well, that's a lot, and if I have to pay a consultant to do this, that's a lot of money to assess soil health. So they have some very obvious questions. So when you look at that comprehensive list, the very cynical approach is you could measure everything and see what sticks statistically, and that's sometimes what I would argue is done. This may make sense scientifically, but it's not very useful for the practitioners or the farmers who are trying to manage the soil. So this leads to some critical questions when you look at that list. Exactly what properties determine soil health? Which ones are essential? And what methods should be used to measure these properties? Are there standards? And these are things we wrestle with the ITPS globally, because every country argues different methods and different standards. And specifically, what quantities of these properties constitute a healthy soil? You can measure all those things, but at some point you have to put targets on it or levels on it. And again, are there standards? And I have not seen definitive answers to any of these questions. So faced with this complexity and uncertainty, I advise students and farmers to focus on only two properties. Two properties they're very familiar with and they should have data for. But only one of these is a soil property. The first is the amount of soil organic carbon. This should not be surprising to anyone. Specifically, the concentration of soil organic carbon in the topsoil and the amount of soil organic carbon over the depth of the soil. And the reason being is soil organic carbon reflects the biologic activity within the soil. A healthy soil is a biologically active soil. Again, referring back to those critters I mentioned in the healthy and unhealthy soil. And organic carbon affects a variety of soil physical, chemical, and biologic properties and processes, such as soil aggregation and nutrient and water holding capacity, and can be associated with soil processes such as respiration and infiltration. All those properties and processes that were listed in that soil health assessment, almost all of them can be connected to soil organic carbon. So importantly, soil organic carbon provides resilience to adverse environmental conditions. A lot of us are speaking more and more about the resilience of soil as being a considerable aspect of soil health. And again, soil organic carbon provides much of that resilience. Now the second property, if you look at this photo, it should be pretty obvious what it is. It's certainly obvious to farmers. The second property is crop growth. Very rarely, if ever, do you see that in the assessment of soil health, which baffles me. Specifically, the above ground biomass and harvest yield. And you can see, looking at these are the ones from Indian Head, and the one on the top is near Miami, Manitoba. And that's not atypical of land that has been degraded, where the health of it has been compromised. You see tremendous impacts on crop yield. And so it is something that farmers can relate to. It is very clearly a property that needs to be considered. Now, relative soil organic carbon content and crop growth are simple. They're readily available measures that integrate the state of the soil and its environment. Those two things, because they integrate so many of the things going on in the soil, are probably the most informative properties you can measure. They both require thorough monitoring and mapping to assess the uniformity and stability of the soil and crop, because if you consider crop yield, you can argue, well, it's a different crop every year, there's different things going on. But if you track it or monitor it over time, you can generate quite a bit of information. And farmers that do have yield maps can tell you this. You can get quite a bit of information to determine whether the soil is healthy or unhealthy and where it is. This last point, this is a powerful way to target. If you know where the problems are, you can target your activities to affect the soil health. You can identify the areas that need the greatest improvement, and that can be used to guide soil management practices to sustain soil health or improve soil health. This leads to what I see as the greatest problem with the concept of soil health. Research on soil health has very limited relevance. Now, there should be a lot of blank stares. As a scientist, I can say this quite with a lot of confidence, that there's a very little relevance, very limited relevance, not little relevance, but limited relevance. And I'm going to explain that. There have been great strides made in understanding soil as a system of physical, chemical, and biologic properties and processes and their complex interactions. There's a lot of time spent on that. It's very well invested. But our understanding of soil health and how agriculture management practices affect it is largely based on small plot research on level, near level, and non-eroded land. This represents about 5% of the landscape, maybe as much as 10 or 15% in some areas where you have the crop land base. That's not a whole lot of area. So I'm going to talk about the rest of that land base. Now, again, so I don't get myself in too much trouble, I recognize that controlled, often artificial conditions are necessary for basic research into processes underlying soil health. But for soil health to have utility, that is for farmers to use it, it needs to be studied on real agricultural land. To develop practices that are effective in protecting and restoring soil health, research needs to be carried out on the areas in greatest need. And to illustrate that point, I'm going to share with you an observation. Very strategically selected this location, Swift Current Research Station. Some of you may have been there, some of you may recognize it. It is one of many agricultural research stations across the country. Now, the research plots where cropping and tillage systems are studied are on land that is relatively flat and non-eroded. You could argue there was some erosion, they're not perfectly flat, but by and large, they're pretty flat, pretty non-eroded. And this is not a unique situation with research stations. This is how they're designed. Now, I'm going to walk through with you a series of images. So this is a Google Earth image showing Swift Current area and the research station circled in red. This image is from December 1985, so after harvest, as we're going into winter. And you can see there's lots of crop residue, at least I can see it, maybe you can't see it, depending on how far back you are. But if you go to Google Earth, you can do the same exercise for yourself in every research station in the country. You can see there's lots of crop residue, indicating lots of conservation tillage. Remember, this is 1985. This is as conservation tillage, or zero-till in the prairies, was kicking into high gear. And remember, conservation tillage is considered to be one of the key practices protecting and restoring soil health. Now here I zoomed in on the research station with its land base and its research plots, just to show you it's relatively a flat piece of land where the research plots are. This isn't all of their plots, but this is some of the key ones that they have. And again, these research plots are absolutely necessary for the development of agricultural practices and products. So I'm not saying that this type of research isn't valuable. It's very valuable. And it's often on those ideal landscapes that are best suited for that type of research. But again, the question, how well do they extend to landscapes of real farms? So that's a recent image. So I'm going to go back to these images. This is the 1985 image from Swift Current. And I picked one area at random with a red box. And I just picked it at random, and I went through and verified that it was represented by picking a whole bunch of other sites in that area, and they all looked the same. So I didn't set this up. I picked it at random and went through this exercise. So even with decades of conservation tillage, remember in 1985 it was clearly zero-till, the majority of the tillage systems in that area. So even with decades of conservation tillage, this is 2018, these farms and their landscapes are facing serious challenges. I hope you can see that those landscapes, the crops, and the vegetation is not uniform. You have eroded patches all over that area where nothing is growing. That's the summer of 2018. And the following spring, same pattern observed, what you see in the residue from the following, or from that crop. And the following summer. And early spring of 2021. These were the photos that were available on Google Earth. And again, I encourage you to go through and do this exercise for yourself. But you can see the same patterns expressed year after year. And later in the spring of 2021, and in the summer of 2021. So clearly, soil health problems are widespread and they persist even after decades of conservation tillage. Now, this is where it gets a bit controversial, if that wasn't already. I contend that conservation tillage is not very effective in restoring soil health. At best, it may simply slow the loss of healthy topsoil and does little to increase soil organic carbon and restore soil health. If you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Tillage itself isn't generating biomass. It's the crop that generates the biomass. Tillage affects how quickly residue breaks down, but it's not producing more biomass in itself. Very indirectly, you may be generating more biomass, but most of the argument is go to conservation tillage, you have the same yields. That's typically the argument. You may save money, but you have the same yields. That was the argument I heard for decades in Ontario. I think it still applies here. Now, I'm going to give you an anecdote. When I first came to Manitoba, I was asked to join the board of the Manitoba Zero-Till Research Association. It's one of the prairie farms that was set up in the prairies. One of them being the Prairie Conservation Farm near Vegreville, and the other one, well, one of the other ones, is the Zero-Till Farm in Manitoba. And I remember sitting on that board, and there was a long-term no-till farmer or zero-till farmer who came up to me and he said, you know, I've been doing zero-till for 20 years, and I haven't seen any improvement in my soil on my hilltops. Just like those photos I showed around Swift Current. And that's because they're not generating more biomass. And it's a little more complex than that. I do have more explanation on this later if you want it after the presentation, but part of the reason is many of these conservation tillage systems are scraping topsoil off those hilltops where you see that soil loss occurring. These are some examples. High disturbance zero-till in the region is very pervasive. And when we've done studies of it, we found that that tillage system, the zero-till system, was as erosive as a moldboard plow. There's a long explanation for why that is the case. It has to do with speed, primarily, and the way that soil is thrown by these operations. We did 2 studies, and both of them showed high-speed soil disturbance associated with zero-till was erosive as a moldboard plow. The other one is we are introducing all kinds of non-tillage operations into zero-till. There are so many farmers in Manitoba now, they're using things like vertical tillage, heavy harrows, and they don't call it tillage. They still say they're zero-till, they're still reported as zero-till, but they're moving a lot of soil, and that's causing soil erosion. It's working against any potential for that zero-till to build up soil organic carbon. Another one, cover crops is another management practice that's being promoted to restore soil health. Now, cover crops, since they introduce more organic matter into the cropping system, may improve soil health. So that's probably a very good assumption. But on those areas that need organic matter, which I'm trying to show here, those areas that need organic matter, it could take a long time to build up organic matter via cover crops. How well do you think a cover crop is going to grow in those eroded hilltops? It's not. So I'll give you another anecdote, because I like anecdotes. My students, I don't know if they like them or not, but I like them. Here's one. I was asked to do research on drought resilience in cropping systems in Manitoba. And I was told that I should work with this researcher doing cover crops. I said, okay. So we got into a discussion about what to look at. And he said, well, I want to do a cover crop study on my farm. And I said, okay. But can we do it on hilly land as well? He said, no. I don't want to do it on hilly land, I want to do it on my land. I've got a nice flat field, and it's perfect for doing cover crop research. And I said, well, someone's laughing back there. I can imagine I understand why. I said to him, I said, well, do you have any hills on your land? He says, yeah, but they're eroded and the cover crops won't grow there. And you may laugh, but that is reality. This really illustrates the nature of research into soil health. It is missing the opportunity to look at the areas that need it most. Okay, I'm in the home stretch here. A more radical approach to restoring soil health where it needs it most on eroded hilltops is the practice of soil landscape restoration. This involves the removal of organic rich soil from the areas of the landscape where soil has accumulated, eroded soil has accumulated, and applying it to areas where it's been lost. Again, there's more of a story behind this, how you have that situation, but this has been recognized since the 1930s in the prairies, that the vast majority of the eroded soil ends up at the bottom of the slope. It's because of tillage. Now, from our research on this practice, it appears that this is the most effective means of restoring soil health. Put the organic matter where it came from, if you want to describe it that way. This increase in soil organic carbon is large, and it's immediate. Now, I have a little anecdote here, but this isn't a critical anecdote, but when I first started looking at this, I remember I talked to Tom Goddard, who's in the back, and I don't know if he's hiding from me or not, but at that time, he introduced me to a couple of reports by the Chinook Area Research Association, and they had looked at these types of things. So farmers were thinking about these things as a means to restore the productivity at that time. They didn't call it soil health. They were trying to restore productivity in these eroded areas of the landscape, those areas that need it restored. And so this has a long history. It actually has history that goes back hundreds of years. And the little anecdote I have about this is I was at a meeting, actually the first Senate hearings a couple years ago. I was presenting my testimony, and my dad, who was also there presenting his testimony, came up to me and said, have you seen this? And he showed me the FEMS, that's the Farm Environmental Management Survey, which is part of the Census of Agriculture data, and this is for the 2016 census. And in there, one of my colleagues from Regina put in a question in the FEMS survey, do you move eroded soil back to the hilltop? That's a very odd question to ask. Guess what percentage of farmers across the country reported doing that? Tom, I'll ask you, since you know a little bit about this. What percentage do you think? That's a very good answer. You may have seen this data. Because it should be zero, right? Because no one ever talks about it. There's never any research done on it other than mine, and often people don't really pay attention to my research. But I thought it would be closer to zero. Well, it turns out it's 3 to 8%, depending which province you're in. On average, 5% of the farmers are doing this, and no one's taking note, except for maybe me. So it's an astounding recognition of this as a practice. And again, it's been used for hundreds of years in some countries, and no one's really considered it as a soil conservation practice or soil health restoration practice. Now, some final thoughts here. If the intent is to do more than protect soil health, that is to enhance and hopefully restore soil health to ensure food security for the future, there's a great need to fully develop the concept of soil health, moving it from simply a soil-based perspective to a landscape-based perspective. And I would suggest land health. And I think the last speaker you had at the Bentley Lecture also referred to land health. I didn't watch all of her presentation. I watched a bit of it, and I was just astounded that she had also mentioned this. It's something that we should be thinking about. It's not just soil pits. It's landscape. And if you can't manage the land, you're going to have problems producing food. And you need to do research at a landscape scale. So this perspective is necessary to understand the impacts of the practices that have degraded and continue to degrade the health of our soils, and to understand how practices can be used to restore the health of the soil. Now, this is not to say there aren't great examples of landscape-based research. Now, this is the family farm again. And back, I mentioned my father put in these landscape strip trials looking at landscape scale soil conservation or conservation tillage performance. And there was one on this portion of the farm and one at the front. And those became a couple of the sites in what became referred to as the Tillage 2000 study from 88 to 93. And the leader of that, or the proponent of that, was Gary Kachanowski, which was the former vice president of research here. He was my advisor for my master's and my PhD. So he and I decided we would, because he's retired now, he can do research again, decided we'd go back and we'd look at these sites. And so we've got a whole bunch of these sites, and we've gone back and we've resampled them, and we're monitoring the crop yield on them, as well as looking at the rates of soil erosion. And we found that after 30 years of no-till, which is what they call it in Ontario, soil organic carbon and soil productivity still have not increased substantially. Again, zero-till or no-till on its own is not going to produce organic matter to restore those hilltops. And if you have any disturbance, even the smallest amount of soil disturbance on those hilltops, you may have no net improvement, even with zero-till and no-till. Now, the final point I have here is another example of soil landscape restoration study we are carrying out as part of the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's Living Labs project in Manitoba. And so there's great hope amongst myself and my research colleagues, and I'm assuming a lot of people across the country, that Ag Canada's Living Lab study is going to start to look at things at a more holistic, more landscape scale, and come up with better solutions that are probably more well-suited to those real landscapes. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for that insightful and fascinating presentation. We have many new thoughts and ideas broadening our perspective holistically now, and with all these hopes that you have been able to share with us. So that's enlightening. We would like to open for questions and also for comments. We have a microphone here. We would like to record the questions so that this can be posted in the website. So please, in case you have questions or comments, raise your hand, and Christine here can bring the microphone to you so that you can actually share your questions or your thoughts. I can imagine there are many items that you would like to share with the speaker, and David will be happy to address your questions. We have here a couple of questions.
Well, David, thank you for the presentation. I guess my question is, you indicated that it's really difficult to quantify soil health, but now you're suggesting that we should quantify land health. So how is that going to make it easier?
I did not say I had all the answers. I said I had some questions, and some good questions. But there is no hope, I don't think, to really come up with a meaningful quantification for farming unless you look at the landscape. It does not mean it's easier, but unless you're looking at the whole landscape, I think it's going to be inadequate. Whatever that definition is, whatever metrics you put on it, it will represent a very small portion of the landscape, which farmers I know will readily discount as being not very useful. But it does not make it easy, but it's certainly providing what I think to be a more useful scope of the problem, and therefore the definitions and the methods of measurement.
Thanks. I think on hilltops, even with the no-till, you said you're not improving any crop growth or yield, so that may be a water problem.
Sorry?
Maybe a water problem, because there is
there is a water problem. Ultimately, if you have no organic matter, you have a soil moisture problem, and so you get like the feedback. If you've got no organic matter, you've got very little ability to infiltrate water, store water, and utilize water. It will end up being a dry, essentially an arid portion of the landscape, which means you will not be able to produce a crop. So you get into that kind of like a perpetual system that's going to fail. So this is why you have to come up with what I would argue is a fairly dramatic solution that allows you to actually get organic matter there and essentially restart the system. And that's where the soil landscape restoration comes in. We've estimated that if you try to do zero-till and I did this for my PhD candidacy exams. I looked at manure on the hilltops, because some farmers do that. It'll take 30 years to increase organic matter 1%. So any of those solutions that we have out there now, even if you're adding organic matter on those, it's a long-term proposition to increase the soil health appreciably.
So maybe water management should be done on the hilltop.
Well, you could argue that, but anyone who irrigates, if that's what you're thinking, it's almost impossible to manage that scale of variability. You could have precision irrigation, and I've heard people talk about that, but not necessarily for big hills, like I was showing where you have the severe soil loss. Certainly you could use precision irrigation practices, and some people do that, but I don't think at the scale that I was showing in my images. Yeah.
We have other questions here in the middle. Constantine, and also here. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Did you consider parameters for measuring soil health outside agricultural fields, even in the same landscape, but even broadly?
Like looking at rangeland or forest land?
Forest land and like elsewhere across Canada where there are like, what did you say, hundreds, tens of thousands?
Well, I said there's certainly hundreds, if not thousands, of soils. And where it could get into thousands, I think in the National Soils Database, it includes soils in the boreal forest and the Arctic and a whole bunch of places not agricultural. I think in the agricultural context, there's certainly hundreds of soils that could be described as healthy in their natural state. Keep in mind, I showed a picture of the Canadian Shield. That's a healthy soil in the Canadian Shield. You wouldn't want to be growing a crop on it, but that's what is healthy for that system. Oh, the approach to measuring it? No, I don't think people have gone beyond agriculture in terms of coming up with robust measures of soil health. Someone's in trouble.
Did you look at any farms that used, could use high concentrations of livestock on those hilltops and like restoring cropland in general by having, a combination of grazing and cultivation?
You could, and we didn't look at something specifically, but you think of integrating livestock into one of those eroded landscapes. Where are the livestock likely going to spend most of their time in terms of their defecation, urination? The lower slope areas where you get more grass growing, right? Exactly, and that's why I know some farmers in Manitoba, and it's probably some out here as well, and they think this is part of the CARA study I mentioned earlier, the Chinook Area Research Association study, is putting manure preferentially on hilltops. So we've had issues in Manitoba where the environmental agencies don't want to put high rates of manure anywhere in the landscape, let alone, anywhere. And I've argued that we should be able to put on 2 or 3 times the recommended rates of manure on eroded hilltops because it's not running off really, and it really needs it. And so we know farmers are doing that. We have not included that in our study, but intuitively we know that's got to help, and that's why farmers are doing it. There's nitrogen, which is a big issue on those areas, as well as organic matter, and that's going to help the crop at least in 1 or 2 years following that manure application.
When they do that manure, do they scratch it into the soil or just put it on top?
They are going through and harrowing it typically, the ones that I'm familiar with. They're going through and trying to get it just lightly incorporated into the soil. They're doing a lot of disturbance. They're not trying to invert the soil like a moldboard plow. They're just trying to get it mixed into the surface soil. And at those rates, it's fine. Now, I had a farmer literally put a foot of beef manure on his hills, and he had problems. So it would be nice if there was some good guidelines that farmers could use to make, one, good use of manure that otherwise put in low-lying areas is an environmental concern, and ensure that they get the best benefit for their agricultural production. But I have not seen any recommendations dealing with manure on landscapes that are eroded.
Hi, do you have any insight on how rolling your land could hasten organic matter breakdown?
Sorry, could you repeat that again?
Do you have any insight on how rolling your land after tillage could improve
Oh.
breakdown?
So land rolling. So we did a study of land rolling as a means of controlling wind erosion or whether it was exacerbating wind erosion. Land rolling is a means to certainly compress the soil, and if you don't have a wind erosion problem, don't have a water erosion problem, that may be a good thing. If you do, you could argue that makes it more prone to wind and water erosion, so there's a whole bunch of issues around erosion. It also can act as a form of tillage erosion because anyone who's used a roller or a packer knows that you drag soil down hills. So as a practice, I would be very cautious of it. Whether or not it does anything to improve the soils on a hilly land, I would say it probably has nothing but negative impacts. So I wouldn't have any recommendations on that.
I'm from central Alberta, Red Deer area, and I farmed all my life, and I really appreciated your input because we live along the Red Deer River Valley, or we farm along it, and of course we got hills.
Mm-hmm.
But we fortuitously ended up with a huge compost facility.
Ah.
And we are putting the compost on the hills, and that's working very well.
Yeah.
The only problem we're having is, of course, if you get adverse weather, the bugs underneath depend on warmer weather and moisture. And if you get a severe weather difference, it can affect the yield, but it's been really helping. And we've got our hilltops now up to 7-8%, and the main farm average is about 11-12% organic matter.
Yeah. And keep in mind, those hilltops will never sustain the organic matter levels of the level landscape and lower landscape. They're more arid, like naturally, right? But if you're at 0 or 1%, getting up to 2 or 3% is great. 7% may not sustain itself over time unless you keep adding more compost onto it. You may have that. But you've illustrated the complexity of doing something like adding manure, not knowing exactly what rate and how to incorporate it, but its complex interaction with the physical and biological aspects of the soil. And all of these things need to be studied if you're going to be putting manure or compost on, or what we're studying is even if you're moving topsoil back up to the hilltop, there's a whole bunch of issues related to the physical, biologic, and chemical properties of the soil after you've done that practice. And like, how deep should we mix in that topsoil once we've added it? Should we mix it at all? There's a whole bunch of questions we really don't understand. And this is why those practices need to be explored.
Hi, David, and thank you for wonderful presentations. I'm going to ask you some hypothetical question here.
Okay, sorry.
About earthworms.
Oh, there you are.
There we go.
Just looking. See?
You know, earthworms are native to Europe, basically, and
Yes.
Eurasia, but we have a lot of invasion right now in Canadian soils. But in Europe, earthworm is really the component of healthy soils in that part of native land. But as soon as they invaded here, they may not be considered part of the healthy soil.
No, but they are an icon of healthy soils, right? We
It is.
all seen the earthworm in
Yeah.
a cartoon form representing good soils. But
Do you see as a threat of earthworms or any other invasives?
I guess it depends what you consider to be a healthy soil. So if it is that natural state, you would argue that having that invasive species, you've compromised the health of that soil. Doesn't mean it's not doing a whole bunch of the biologic, chemical, and physical functions you'd want with nematodes or other organisms or critters in the soil, but you have upset the natural balance. So it could be a threat to a healthy soil. But certainly, I would argue that if you've got earthworms in your soil, because you have life in your soil, real visible life, it's probably in a fairly healthy state relative to if it could not support earthworms or other critters. But it's a very good point. Most people don't realize that earthworms are invasive.
All right, so
I think maybe we could do one more. Is there one last question that somebody wants?
We have
Okay,
one more
right at the
question
back.
there.
I'm coming to you.
Thanks for the presentation. I'm just wondering about sort of decision horizons, and as we talk about some of these practices being adopted on farm, when you talk about soil organic carbon, it's a pretty long horizon to see improvement, right?
Yeah.
So 2 questions. One, how long does a farmer need to continue to implement a practice, particularly with something like hilltops, before they're going to be able to see that change? And is there any research going on to speed that up so that they know they're headed in the right direction?
It depends what change you're looking for. So there's 2 parts to that. If you're looking at a practice like soil landscape restoration, where you have that immediate effect on soil organic carbon, they end up experiencing the yield bump immediately, right? So there's no time to waste. But if you think about generally how long it takes to sequester carbon, when you use that practice, so keep in mind that soil landscape restoration practice I described, you're moving carbon from one area of the landscape to another. That's not really creating any sequestration, it's shuffling the material around on the landscape. So I don't usually describe that practice as causing carbon sequestration directly. But the indirect impact by having more crop growing uniformly and consistently year in and year out does cause more biomass to be produced, which is the source of the carbon you want to sequester, the photosynthetic carbon. So it does have an indirect impact that would persist those effects, hopefully, tens, hundreds of years.
Well, thank you everyone for those questions, and also thank you, David, for being able to elaborate all those answers and connections, and also thank you for sharing the experience that came from some of the participants. To close this participation, we have a token of appreciation for David for coming and sharing all these insights with us. This is come from Alberta Arts and Craft, and it's something you can take back to Manitoba, and we will keep with us the hopes and the insight that you were able to share with us today. So thank you very much. One more hand for the speaker.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for your attention. I also would like to highlight the fact that behind these events, we have the support of many people who help us in many different ways, in many different capacities. Christine, who helped us in many different ways to organize the event, Christy as well, Sarah, and many others who had help in many other capacities. So one hand for them as well to be able to develop this event. So we are only able to do it with their support. And now I turn things back to Brent for some other comments and follow-ups regarding the poster sessions as well.
Okay, so let's, I'd like to acknowledge our judges again. So Uahake, where are you? Uahake had to go. Okay, but he's supposed to do the announcement, so I guess I'm going to have to do it. So April Bergstrom she was here for judging with the Sustainability Council, and David Lloyd from Alberta Institute of Ecologists. So thank you very much to our judges. The judges really focused on the communication aspects of the work that was presented, and 3 of our best communicators are receiving an award. And they are, drum roll please. Oh, very good, thank you. Tianyi Zhao. Hey, Tianyi, congratulations. So that presentation was on evaluating the effects of hammerlight on canola drought stress tolerance. So well done. Second, not second, but the second of 3. Yamin Achtiamchuk, or something like that. Jamin? Jamin's presentation was on sequester modeling of soil organic matter evolution on at the Breton plots that are nice and smooth and level, I think, right? And then our first prize winner is Emily McDonald. And thanks for having the longest title. So Phosphorus Sipson Stack Reclamation, how does water potential and bulk density of phosphogypsum effect, root patterns, and above ground vitality of Populus balsamifera? Question mark. Okay, so it's great to have the students presenting their work, gets them chances to showcase with us, which is a great group of people for them to share their work with, give them practice for the next round. So thank you very much for everyone coming with posters and for all of you to share it in that poster session. Okay, so just to wrap up, we have a cash bar at the back here. So you can just pay cash or debit for drinks until 5:30. So we have a crowd of 5:30. We have the room until something like 6. We hope that you can. I think the posters are still there. So you can walk back and forth. I think, yeah, you can walk back and forth with your drink to the other room where the posters will be, and some of the students will be there too. So thank you all very much for coming today.